I'm Professor Michelle Foster. I'm the Dean of the Melbourne Law School, and it's my great pleasure to warmly welcome you to the 2024 Baxt Lecture. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting this evening on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to Elders past, present and emerging. And I extend this acknowledgement to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. Now, the Baxt Lecture is an annual public lecture series of the Melbourne Law School's Competition Law and Economics Network, named in honour of the esteemed competition law professor, Robert Baxt, AO Emeritus, in recognition of his substantial contributions to the development of competition law in Australia. Robert Baxt was an Australian lawyer and chairman of the Trade Practices Commission, the government agency that preceded the ACCC, from 1988 to 1991. He was Dean of Law at Monash University and a Professorial Fellow of the University of Melbourne. Robert also served as Chair of the Advisory Board of the Competition and Consumer Law Specialty in the Melbourne Law Masters Program, providing support and guidance to shape this program into a world-class offering. In his honour, this lecture series aims to provide a forum to discuss and debate significant competition law issues across Australia and internationally. And I would like to welcome in particular the members of the Baxt family that are here with us tonight, Ruth, Robert's wife, and Simone, Robert's daughter, who have joined us this evening. And I want to acknowledge their family's continued support of Melbourne Law School in the tradition of their late husband and father. Welcome, Ruth and Simone. It is now my pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Alison Jones. Professor Jones is an expert in EU competition law and US antitrust law. She holds a PhD from the University of Cambridge and is a Professor of Law at King's College London. She also practices as a solicitor at British firm Freshfields. Alison has a very impressive publication record, which I won't outlay tonight, but it includes the core Oxford University press text for law students on EU competition law called Jones and Suffren's EU competition law text cases and materials. Professor Jones has also undertaken a lot of what we would call research translation work. She's prepared reports for the European Commission, for the UK government and the US House Judiciary Committee on antitrust, on commercial and administrative law issues. And the topic of Professor Jones' presentation tonight is combating collusion and corruption in public procurement. Before I hand over to Professor Jones, I'll note that she has generously agreed to take questions. So please, if questions arise in your mind as she's presenting, collate them and we will take them at the end of the presentation. And I also just want to remind you that tonight's event is being recorded and will later be published on the Melbourne Law School website. But now, without further ado, I warmly welcome you, Professor Jones. Thank you for being here.
You can now, that's turned on and you can hear me. Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here at Melbourne Law School and to be invited to be part of this very prestigious lecture series. It's wonderful to be here. It's my first time ever in Melbourne. So I'd like to extend my thanks to the law faculty for inviting me here today. So as you've heard, my research is principally focused on the area of competition law, especially EU competition law and US antitrust law. But today, my presentation is going to focus a little bit more broadly on the topic of combating collusion, supply collusion, and corruption, for reasons I'll explain in a moment, in public procurement. This is the subject matter of a recent monograph I've co-authored with Robert Anderson and Bill Kovacic. So as the title of the lecture suggests, I will, therefore, like the book, touch on three distinct areas of law. Not only competition law and policy towards cartels that involve the rigging of bids for public tenders, but also the laws which seek to control corruption in this context where public officials improperly steer public contracts to favoured bidders either in return for improper compensation or as a result of favoritism. It'll also touch on corruption and collusion control provisions in public procurement systems which govern purchasing with public money. So in this lecture, what I'm going to seek to do is three things. First of all, to highlight the importance of the topic, combating corruption and collusion in public procurement, and why it should be a priority for governments, policymakers, and relevant agencies, despite the numerous other challenges they face and have to address. Second, to explain why, despite significant efforts that have already been taken by governments across the world to protect procurement processes from corruption and collusion, existing and conventional efforts to fight this problem don't seem to be working. Third, I'd like to discuss a variety of different measures that can be adopted to try and make a public procurement system more resilient to these practices through bolstering and improving existing regimes, and in particular, ensuring that relevant agencies and institutions work together to develop a pro-competitive procurement system. Although I'll discuss the types of problems that frequently occur in different jurisdictions and make some general proposals for reform, of course, the specific measures required to achieve change in any jurisdiction will depend on a careful diagnosis of the problems arriving in that system and targeted steps to address them. So by way of example, what I will do is try and say a few words about the position in the UK, reflect on the problems that might be occurring there, and how weaknesses in its system might be addressed. So turning first to the first question, why should combating corruption and collusion in public procurement be a priority? Well, at the core, because what is at stake is huge sums of public money and goods, services, works, and infrastructure which are vital to the economy and citizens. Every year, governments around the world spend vast sums of money on the purchase of, for example, critical infrastructure, energy for transport and energy, and medical, health, and defense facilities. For many countries, the spending amounts to about 30% of public sector spending and millions of dollars. So I've put up here an example in the UK. A recent House of Commons research briefing estimated that the UK spending on public procurement amounted to $329 billion in 2021 to 22. That looks like that number is increasing over the years, and that represents about 1/3 of public sector spending. So vast sums of money and very important purchasing. If public procurement is done well, then scarce public resources can be maximized, and the government can provide its citizens with more and better public goods and services, at the same time as nurturing competition and innovation in markets and instilling confidence in itself. In contrast, if public procurement processes are distorted by corruption or collusion, the converse will be true. The quantity and quality of public goods and services will be reduced, and precious taxpayer money will be squandered or improperly diverted. This in turn will breed frustration amongst citizens about the misuse of public money and mistrust in governments and its institution. Indeed, an extensive body of reports and academic literature highlight the significant financial costs of these practices, and also more broadly, their negative impact on, for example, economic growth, human development, poverty reduction, national security, and more generally, citizen satisfaction with life. A serious problem, therefore, is that not only are public procurement processes very difficult to manage well, but they are inherently vulnerable to corrupt and collusive practices because they provide both opportunities and alluring incentives for such conduct to take place. For example, certain features of public procurement processes, such as their regular nature, the value, volume, and the conditions under which they take place, may make it easier for firms to align their behaviour and engage in bid rigging agreements. The same features may also, by increasing transparency, facilitate the identification of internal deviations and external threats to any collusive equilibrium, meaning that cartelists can react rapidly to them. A further difficulty is that procurers, who are in the best position to identify and detect any bid rigging practices that might be occurring, may not be incentivized to do so, because identification of bid rigging will disrupt the completion of the process they are employed to conduct. As I've already indicated, procurers may even in some situations be drawn into and form part of the collusive scheme, so in return for a reward, helping to bolster its operation and stability. Indeed, it's clear that public procurement processes managed not by the intended beneficiaries of the procurement, nor by those providing the funds, constitute one of the highest corruption activities, given the large value of the contracts often involved, the close relationships that may be formed between procurers and businesses, and the difficulty of detecting improper conduct in this area. As a result, individuals may face huge temptations to exploit their office in return for a personal or partisan benefit, such as a bribe, holidays, offers of employment, or even political donations. And similarly, companies will also face strong temptations to pay bribes or to rig bids if by doing so they are able to make enhanced profits from winning lucrative large-scale procurement contracts. So on the right side here, I've put some examples of the kinds of temptations and incentives that might exist. So for example, in Brazil, one senior official found to have been involved in the Operation Car Wash scandal, a perverse corruption and collusive scheme affecting public procurement in Brazil, agreed in a plea deal to return nearly $97 million that had been received in bribes and had been deposited in bank accounts abroad. Further, the huge construction company at the center of the bid rigging and bribery scheme, Odebrecht, was found to have paid $788 million in bribes to officials, which enabled it to earn significant profits from the contracts awarded. I've also put in an example of a relatively small case, which was a recent case in the UK, where a Ministry of Defence official was found to have been paid $70,000, but that represented 10% of the 3 contracts awarded in return for the bribes. The central significance of public procurement and the need to shield it from corruption and collusion isn't something that's new. Rather, it's well known, and numerous international initiatives and academic commentary have led to some consensus around the question of how to construct robust systems to fight these practices, and the adoption of reform of national laws that reflect that consensus. Consequently, many jurisdictions around the world, including all of the ones that we examined in our book, have in place relatively sophisticated public procurement systems, providing generally for fair, transparent, open, and competitive public procurement processes. In addition, many of them have stringent anti-corruption and competition laws in place that prohibit bribery and bid rigging cartels and incorporate stringent penalties for infringing those rules and effective enforcement mechanisms. Because many of these have been influenced by the same international initiatives, they do have some similarities and recognize the need for an integrated approach in this area. But are they working? Although it's generally pretty difficult to estimate and measure the volume of corruption and collusion that occurs because these practices tend to be committed in secret and hidden, our book echoes the concerns raised by many commentators that these international and national efforts, which have driven the kind of the set of laws that I've just referred to, have produced limited or disappointing results, even in advanced industrial, generally well-governed and relatively keen economies, and even in times of national crisis. Indeed, we note that in some jurisdictions, examples of both practices occurring continue to be exposed by law enforcement agencies with depressing regularity. In others, reports and indices paint a picture that's suggesting that all may not be well, that corruption and collusion may in fact be occurring, and that the actual cases of corruption and collusion exposed may just be the tip of the iceberg, with many other incidents hiding below the waterline. This suggests, perhaps, that rather than giving up in the face of new laws, it seems that the attractive incentives that we've discussed that encourage wrongdoing in this area may mean that firms and individuals have simply adapted and have been able to exploit ongoing weaknesses that they find within the systems adopted. So, what might those weaknesses be? They may derive from gaps in the law or other flaws within the systems. Of course, the success of any set of laws or regime depends not just on good laws themselves, but also on political commitment to them and their effective application, implementation, and enforcement. It may be, therefore, that despite the objectives of public procurement laws, the regimes are still leaving the door open or ajar to corruption and collusion, and that fair, open, transparent, and competitive public procurement processes may not actually be happening as frequently as they should be. This could be perhaps because there are poorly defined exclusions or overly broad derogations to competitive bidding rules, or because perhaps procurement processes themselves incorporate stringent bidding criteria within them or technical specifications which actually restrict the pool of bidders and suppress rather than stimulate competition. In some cases, it could be that procurers are simply just not trained well enough or lack the resources they required to carry out their remit. A further problem could be that there's weak oversight of the public procurement regimes, or that an anti-corruption organizational culture has not been sufficiently developed within institutions. Anti-corruption and competition laws may also have gaps, or may not be having the deterrent effect intended if detection levels or violations are low, or penalties for infringement are insufficiently dissuasive. So, incentives for law breakings will remain if expected benefits from wrongdoing will exceed or outweigh the anticipated costs. The existence of a low level of detection and prosecution in this area isn't that surprising, given the complexities involved in uncovering and prosecuting this practice and the pressure on competition authorities and anti-corruption agencies to deal with an ever broader set of concerns. For example, as we well know, in the competition law context, agencies are having to deal with an expanding set of challenges, in particular and including dealing with new practices and increasing concentration in the digital economy, dealing with excessive pricing cases in some situations, and considering how competition law may support perhaps sustainability or other public policy initiatives. They've got an ever-growing set of concerns on their plate. In the anti-corruption context, law enforcers may also have to choose between investigating complex economic crime or focusing their limited resources on other serious crimes. Another problem could be that despite the efforts to integrate policies in this area, that the regimes, the public procurement, anti-corruption and competition law regimes, may in fact remain relatively siloed, with insufficient coordination between public procurers, anti-corruption and competition agencies or institutions. So where these problems take place, these types of problems exist and take place, further steps will be required to strengthen the working of the regime. So how might that happen? To bolster a regime, it may therefore be necessary to introduce measures which enable the public procurement, anti-corruption and competition law regimes themselves to work better, but also to work better together with the other regimes. These reforms should be focused not just on deterring corruption and collusion, which is difficult and costly, as we've just discussed, but also by making renewed efforts to prevent the conduct from happening in the first place through the bolstering of the public procurement regime. Thus, corruption and collusion opportunities could be reduced in public procurement processes by, for example, making sure that competitive bidding is the norm and derogations from such processes are clearly articulated and limited, ensuring professionalization of the workforce so that they have capacity and the capability to perform their job, developing an anti-corruption organizational culture and ensuring that codes of conduct and registers of conflicts of interest are in place, and considering a range of other measures to strengthen the integrity of the system, such as the fine-tuning of appropriate and proportionate rules which permit the exclusion of firms representing a risk to the public procurement processes from bidding, enhancing oversight procedures, and making tenderers bidding for contracts sign a certificate of independent bidding, saying that they have made their bids independently and not in conjunction with other firms operating on the market. At the same time, a number of measures could be taken to improve the working of the anti-corruption and competition laws as to increase their deterrent effect and ensure that relevant players don't feel that they can act within impunity. This could be achieved, for example, through reviewing laws and identifying gaps within them, prioritizing enforcement in this area, ensuring full use of the agency's detection methods and powers to impose sanctions. In the competition law sphere, for example, competition authorities have relied quite heavily on leniency schemes as an important mechanism for inducing the provision of evidence, especially first evidence of an offence. There's a growing concern, however, that these have their limits, and our authorities should not be overly reliant on them. Agencies should also try, therefore, to collect evidence from a broader range of sources. Public procurement officials could be one source, as we've already mentioned, employees, but other informants could be capable of delivering credible evidence. They could also develop their own proactive detection techniques by screening and monitoring markets more carefully. If they bolster and make more extensive use of their detection techniques in this way, not only might they uncover evidence of conduct that would otherwise remain hidden or stable under a standalone leniency regime, but they will also increase the effectiveness of those regimes. Firms might be more willing to use them if they think that their conduct will be uncovered if they don't self-report it. Some jurisdictions are also quite heavily reliant on corporate fines to sanction infringements of competition law. Even if high, however, they may not be able to be sufficiently high to deter what we've seen can be highly profitable conduct for the companies involved. There may therefore be a need to ensure that sanctions are also imposed on individuals involved in the misconduct, and that there is a possibility perhaps that the infringing companies will be excluded from future public procurement processes. This would make it clear to those companies that access to public contracts depends on genuine efforts to ensure compliance with the law. Finally, it seems clear that in many jurisdictions, more could be done to ensure that taxpayer money is recovered where wrongdoing has occurred. So, for example, if a bid rigging has occurred, which has increased the cost for the government of buying those particular goods or services affected by the bid rigging cartel, the government should routinely bring damages actions to obtain compensation in relation to the overpayments that have been made. I've highlighted already the importance of these regimes not operating in silos and there being coordination between relevant agencies in institutions. So coordination between those agencies and institutions will help to achieve and deliver these changes. For example, a competition authority could, with advocacy efforts, work with the government itself to try and make sure that exclusions from competitive tendering processes are kept to a minimum. They could work with the government to get them to put in place compulsory competition law training programs for procurers, and I'll come back to that in a moment, and mechanisms for clawing back taxpayer money when bid rigging is encountered, as I've just described. Competition authorities can also work with procurers, training them on the benefits of competitive tendering, how to design tenders to reduce the risk of collusion, how to report bid rigging suspicions to the competition authority, and to encourage procurement institutions to put in place incentives that will actually encourage the procurers to report bid rigging. I've already explained that their incentives might otherwise be skewed to trying to ensure that the contract goes ahead and not to disrupt it by having to start the process again if bid rigging is uncovered. Competition agencies could also work with anti-corruption agencies because, as I've explained, corruption and collusion do quite often work together in this sphere. Not always, but they can work together and make each other more stable. If they worked closely with anti-corruption agencies, they can ensure a mutual understanding of each other's remits and that further information can be exchanged between them when conduct that might be relevant to the other comes to their attention. Competition agencies can also engage more actively with businesses to raise awareness of competition laws and to encourage greater compliance with the rules. So I'll turn now from the general to the more specific and look at the position in the UK. In so doing, I'm actually going to focus on the law in England and Wales because slightly different rules apply in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. So, in the UK, a commonly held view that is heard is that we don't really need to worry about this problem. It's a very clean economy, and spending is protected by comprehensive public procurement, anti-corruption and competition laws enforced by highly respected enforcement institutions. And there are, in fact, relatively few cases of these practices impacting on domestic procurement processes being uncovered. But is this view justified? It's true that the components of a comprehensive regime are in place. First, our current and soon to be adopted new public procurement laws aim to ensure that public procurement processes achieve value for money and avoid favoritism. They provide for competitive tendering processes as the norm and incorporate a range of other measures, some of which we've discussed already, to ensure their smooth operation and that they're protected as well as possible from corrupt and collusive practices. Through, for example, ensuring transparency in the publication of information relating to processes, provisions for the disregarding of bids from excluded suppliers that represent a risk to the process, and review procedures allowing challenges to processes by disappointed bidders. In the competition law sphere, we also have civil and criminal offences for cartel activity. In 1998, a new Competition Act was introduced in the UK, which prohibits undertakings, that term we use for any entity engaged in economic activity, from concluding bid rigging cartels. The Act is enforced by the UK Competition Authority, the Competition and Markets Authority, which acts as an integrated decision taker and can impose fines in its administrative procedure when it finds an infringement of the rules to have occurred. It can also seek a disqualification order against company directors involved in a violation. The Competition Act can also be enforced privately by those affected by a violation. So anybody injured by a violation could, in theory, bring an action for damages to seeking compensation for the loss suffered as a result of the infringement. In 2002, the Enterprise Act layered a new cartel offence on top of the Competition Act regime. The criminal cartel offence it introduced applies to individuals, not to companies. And it was introduced specifically with the objective of increasing deterrence to cartel activity. the criminal cartel offence can be enforced by the Competition Authority, the CMA, or the Serious Fraud Office, and it can result in significant penalties. Individuals convicted can be imprisoned for up to 5 years, and unlimited fines can be imposed. The UK also has stringent anti-corruption laws. In particular, in 2010, the Bribery Act overhauled a whole patchwork of anti-corruption laws that had developed and introduced laws criminalising active, passive, and foreign bribery. So that's paying a bribe or receiving or soliciting a bribe, and bribery of foreign officials. It also introduced, because of the difficulties of holding companies liable for bribery, it also introduced a strict liability offence for corporations that failed to prevent bribery, so a failed to prevent offence, unless those companies can establish they have adequate procedures in place to prevent it. The Act can be enforced by the Serious Fraud Office, or prosecuted by the Serious Fraud Office or the Director of Public Prosecutions. Both the Competition Authority and criminal investigators have significant powers to detect and obtain information about infringements. So there's good laws in place. It's also true that few cases of corruption and collusion have been exposed under the Competition Act, Enterprise Act, or the Bribery Act, or preceding laws. Nonetheless, it may be the case that actually the cases that have been exposed are just the tip of that iceberg that I mentioned earlier. So I've put on this slide here a range of different government and non-governmental sort of reports and surveys that do suggest that the scarcity of cases might not be because these rules are having their desired effect, rather that these practices may be occurring undetected under the waterline. In addition, the Serious Fraud Office has uncovered more cases of foreign bribery, that is, bribery of officials in a foreign company. So raising the question of whether firms willing to engage in unethical and unlawful behaviour abroad might also be willing to engage in such behaviour in the UK. It seems feasible, therefore, that this mismatch between revealed cases and perceptions could be because weaknesses in the system are preventing them from achieving their objectives. Indeed, once you put the system under the microscope, it seems that a number of the generic problems that I have already described might actually exist within the UK system. So, for example, in relation to public procurement, it appears that the old system, at least, provided insufficient safeguards for direct awards without competition, such as in emergency purchasing situations. These weaknesses were highlighted during the COVID pandemic. There may also be insufficient training of procurers and monitoring of processes, especially this is more difficult at the local level, and a rather weak anti-corruption organisational culture in some institutions. It's also been unclear how the complex exclusion powers have been used, and there is no legal requirement to use certificates of independent bidding or to require certificates of independent bidding from tenderers, although they may be used sometimes in practice. There's no legal obligation to do so. Further, it does seem that the deterrent effect of the cartel and bribery rules seems rather low, because there is a picture of limited enforcement, both in relation to bid rigging and bribery impacting on domestic public procurement processes, at least. So although the CMA is now focusing more closely on bid rigging, and I'll come back to that point in a moment, to date, there have only been a handful of civil cases brought under the Competition Act, and the criminal cartel offence has not been a success. Convictions under the criminal regime have only occurred in a very few cases following guilty pleas, and so only following guilty pleas. And the CMA now seems to have little appetite to enforce the criminal cartel provisions and relies mainly on its administrative process instead under the Competition Act. This could be because a moral case for criminalisation of this type of conduct hasn't yet been sufficiently built, because procedural complications arise from the coexistence of the civil and criminal regimes, and or because the CMA lacks criminal law expertise. Most of its activities occur under administrative, not a criminal framework. Further, although the Serious Fraud Office has brought a number of, I've already mentioned, foreign bribery cases, it has not yet brought a criminal cartel offence case, and there have been relatively very few cases brought by either the SFO or the DPP in which bribery has impacted on domestic public procurement processes. So all of this suggests that some of the measures for improving the system that I've already mentioned should perhaps be considered in the UK. So although the new Procurement Act adopted last year will deal with some of the problems identified in the public procurement sphere, for example, the rules will guard more effectively against favouritism where direct awards are made, and strengthen the exclusion and debarment system, it won't deal with all of them. There does remain, therefore, room for steps to be taken to ensure that the public procurement workforce is trained more systematically on competition law, to ensure better capture and analysis of procurement data, to ensure adherence of transparency and publication rules, to develop a better counter-fraud and anti-corruption culture in government, particularly at the local level, and to build closer relationships between procurers and the law enforcement agencies, CMA and SFO in particular. In addition, to increase the deterrent effect of anti-corruption and competition laws, it really seems essential that enforcement in this area is prioritised. In the last few years, the CMA has started to do so, but in relation to corruption, there's no specialised investigative unit for targeting domestic corruption affecting public purchasing. It's not the case in all countries. Agencies could also work more closely with businesses to ensure use of compliance programs and take steps to ensure that they're not overly reliant on leniency or self-reporting schemes. The competition agency could, for example, work with procurers to monitor public procurement processes for bid rigging, consider how to incentivise whistleblowing further, and to introduce some form of data screening tools, a technique which is being developed by a number of other competition agencies around the world. I've also mentioned that already the one problem in the UK in the cartel sphere is that the criminal cartel offence has largely fallen into abeyance. Indeed, the UK experience has been that it's not easy to make criminalisation work effectively in this area. Not only are criminal cases, because of the higher standard of proof, more difficult to establish, but it's really difficult to persuade juries to convict persons or to persuade courts to imprison offenders. Although the CMA now routinely seeks disqualification orders against company directors in civil proceedings, so targeting individuals in that way, thought does need to be given to the question of whether the criminal cartel offence should be retained and whether new life should be breathed into it, and if so, how. If it is to be retained, one way of generating support for the criminal cartel programme could be to target on prosecutions in this area, bid rigging cases which negatively impact on the purchase of vital public goods and services. Such cases are also more likely to prove difficult for those prosecuted to defend, especially if the conduct has been clearly hidden and if certificates of independent bidding have actually been signed by the bid riggers. Other additional changes to the offence could be considered to try and make it work more smoothly. So if we take this area, currently, if corruption and collusion were to occur together, then prosecution of the bid rigging and the companies and the individuals involved and the procurers would require a number of different investigators and prosecutors to be involved. We would have to invoke the two different competition regimes and the anti-corruption regime, which all have different processes. Synergies would clearly be unlocked if all elements of bid rigging and bribery in relation to both corporations and individuals could be probed together. So one way of enabling this to happen would be to expand the criminal offence to legal persons as well as individuals, and to those promoting or aiding bid rigging. So here it is falling to abeyance, and this is a suggestion to actually extend the ambit of it. Although criminalising corporate cartel behaviour would simply just raise the evidential bar for prosecutors without substantially changing the available sanctions, it would achieve these procedural synergies, and proceedings against corporations might actually be facilitated if, in a similar way to the Bribery Act, a separate failure to prevent the conclusion of an unlawful cartel agreement were introduced, albeit subject to a defence that the company had adequate procedures in place to prevent such actions. If the criminal offence is to be retained and expanded in this way, consideration would need to be given to who would have responsibility for enforcing the offence. A particular problem we have now is neither the CMA nor the SFO have yet really displayed much appetite for enforcing the rules. So it may be that another entity, such as a newly created police unit targeting corruption and collusion impacting on public purchasing, we could be entrusted with the investigative task. It also appears, I think, that no civil action for damages has ever been lodged by a public procurement in England and Wales that's been a victim of bid rigging. So taxpayer money is being left on the table when the competition agency enforces the rules and imposes fines. That money does not go to the victims of the infringement. A programme could therefore be developed in the UK, for example, perhaps by ensuring that responsibility for recovery of damages on behalf of public procurers is conferred on a central body. I need to finish now. I'm just going to say one very quick word about this last style as a postscript or a final word. Our book recognises that although it's difficult, as we just discussed, it's difficult. This is a difficult and complex issue to resolve. Things become even more difficult and complex to resolve when corruption is endemic or becoming entrenched within a system. In this situation, the measures that I've just described are unlikely to work on their own, especially because the corruption may be being driven not only by individual incentives, but because it's expected. And so, for example, businesses feel that they need to pay bribes if they are going to be able to win a contract. So there's a collective action problem. So in such jurisdictions, law enforcement may not be easily possible, or it may be subverted or face backlash if tried, and it means that laws are likely to have to be refashioned and combined with political and institutional reform. So, in conclusion, corruption and collusion continue, it seems, to plague many public procurement systems, despite international and national efforts to combat them and the significant harm that they clearly cause. We've seen that extensive challenges are involved in trying to make sure a system ensures its effectiveness and makes public procurement a less protected environment. Many jurisdictions around the world, therefore, do need to protect the processes and think about bolstering their established tools, putting in place new solutions, and ensuring greater policy coordination between relevant authorities.